今天是元宵节了，朋友们啊，先祝愿朋友们佳节欢乐。那么昨天呢，安排了一个采访，与大卫·史迪威将军有一个长谈。史迪威将军是1980年参军的，然后在美国空军服役35年，2015年退役，当时的军衔是准将。他还担任过参谋长联席会议主席的亚洲顾问，美国驻中国北京大使馆的国防专员。在川普政府时期呢，他还担任了东亚及太平洋事务助理国务卿。所以朋友们，你看他这个负责的方向就知道，他是一个面对中共打交道的美国政府第一线的官员。而且呢，因为他也精通韩语，他是韩语的专家呀，也会日语，也会一部分的中文，所以呢，在很大意义上来说呢，他是一个中国通。其实让我感兴趣的还有他这个名字，就是史迪威。那很多朋友知道，历史上很有名的，对不对？国共这个历史上呢有很有名的史迪威将军，加上他这个将军头衔嘛，加上他对东亚事务、对今天中国事务的深度介入，让我们不禁就想到了二战的那个中国战区参谋长约瑟夫·史迪威将军。那个老史迪威呢，跟蒋介石熟悉历史的朋友都知道，他矛盾很大。那史迪威跟中共非常友好，甚至还谋划过对蒋介石的暗杀。那么这两个史迪威之间有没有亲戚关系啊？因为现在这个当代版的，咱们昨天聊天的这个史迪威，又有着与老史迪威对中国、对中国共产党、对于中华民国在台湾有哪些曾经的相似，又有了怎样的深刻的不同呢？今天呢，咱们一会儿就先放一个20分钟的剪辑版，聊天呢是用英文进行的。所以围绕是三个主题两个史迪威的时代，中美台关系发生了怎样的变化，还维系着怎样的信念和承诺。冬季奥运会，大国较量，在中美之间比谷爱凌更巧妙地隐藏着巨大的利益的究竟是谁？中俄关系发展有前途吗？普京的乌克兰，习近平的台湾，两个人会不会互相投桃报李，互相支援呢？等中文翻译完成之后大概我想有个2天时间吧，朋友们见谅然后呢，我们把这个全篇放在希望之城会员网站上，欢迎大家前去欣赏观看。那么现在呢，咱们就先来看看这个仓促之间剪辑的一个20分钟的版本。Okay, so how Mr. David Steele?
How are you doing?
Hi, I'm very glad to have you here to take this interview and come to my channel. And I believe that about 800,000 subscribers of this channel would also be very happy to have your voice here. So actually, General Stilwell have been acquaintance to my channel viewers. Since General Stilwell served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs in the Trump administration, and helped Mr. Pompeo and the Department of State to contribute many impressive policies concerned about China. As what's the word? 中国通, China hand, right? Yeah, as
不是中国通。
Yeah, hi guys. You know, Mr. Stilwell can speak Chinese very well.
I used to joke with the ambassador, 崔天开，你应该是美国通。But all the advice that they gave to Xi Jinping for the last 4 years, I think was wrong. I think the advice was wrong. They did not take us seriously. And it was unfortunate because we had a lot of opportunities to keep the relationship from going so far, toward the negative side. But between Yang Jiechi, Cui Tiankai, I don't know what they were telling Zhong Nanhai. It wasn't the right answer because they did not take us seriously at all. And we had to take some strong steps.
Because they changed their tones. Before that, they wanted China hand, they want to hear the voices from the Western world because they want to communicate and earn something and benefit from the Western world. But right now, they changed the tone. They want Western to hear their stories.
Right.
That's the reason. So they just pretend to neglect the voices from all the China hands, from all the kindly advices. That's what I'm thinking about. So that changed. The whole world changes.
It makes me wonder, though, did Yang Jiechi try to tell the leadership to change course, to negotiate? I know Liu He made the points that we should take the threat seriously about tariffs and a trade response, and they didn't listen. I wonder if that was Yang Jiechi, Cui Diankai, and all the rest. Did they also give that advice, and was it not taken? Maybe Zhong Nanhai didn't listen. Well, in history, when we read about this in 10 years, 20 years, we'll know. But that's a question I've had for a long time is, we were serious. What message got communicated back to Beijing?
The American government is seriously, and the Western world is serious. They want the whole China and the Chinese people can change into a kind of a better situation to comply with the whole world, with the universal value. That's what they're the kind, the nice heart to tell them to do so. But in China, even Yang Jiechi and Liu He you were familiar with, they are more a Chinese Communist Party member than a normal than a common people. So they will follow the instruction from their leader first, from Xi Jinping first. Once Xi Jinping's idea, once Xi Jinping's Communist Party leader's idea changes, their dream change, their tone changes. Yeah. Even Yang Jiechi and Liu He were the people, they have a they are very familiar with the Western world, Western value.
Exactly. It's dangerous because there are there are a few times where I had to disagree with my boss and other people on some ideas that were floated and say, I don't think this is a good idea. And in our system, they will actually listen to that and they won't take me out and shoot me for disagreeing. They value the courage it takes to stand up and say, let's not do that. So I know it's a tough situation right now in the Gongchandang, in the leadership. People, I don't think, it's like the Mao era, right? People are afraid to disagree with the supreme leader, the He Xin. It's dangerous because they're going to miscalculate and we're going to end up in a really bad position.
It's been a long story of this kind of a situation. This kind of, we call it 明君文化 in Chinese, 明君文化. Many Chinese people, they are looking forward a kind of a very nice, very kind, and very wise emperor or king to lead them, no matter what party they belong to. So there's a story, and it's a long story. And the Communist Party, that's why Communist Party can have a deep root into the Chinese culture. Even the Soviet Union is broken. There is no Soviet Union, CCCP anymore, but the CCP exists and even bigger, a stronger economic tyrant in the world. So in this case, I think, many Chinese officials, they like you mentioned Yang Jiechi and Liu He, they're familiar with the Western culture and they understand the American very, very much, but they just pretend to pronounce another tone. There's a kind of it's against their conscience, it's self-conscious. But for many American officials, they pronounce. They send out their voices according to their conscience. 首先非常吸引我的一点呢，这个史迪威将军就是您的中文说得很好。我看了您的简历，就是您在空军服役了30年，主要都在韩国、日本这些东亚地区。那么这些国家的语言文字、民俗文化都还有中华文化的影子。您还担任过美国驻华使馆的军事随员。我想我们的采访嘛，就从您学习中文的经历开始，好不好？您是什么时候开始学习中文，并了解东亚文化圈的呢？这些兴趣或者语言技能怎样帮助了您的职业生涯？
I started in Korean as an Air Force enlisted, Shirping. And But my Korean instructor taught me the Hanzi. He was very serious about Hanzi. So I studied those. And when it came time to take Chinese for 3 years at the Air Force Academy, I never broke a book because I knew all the characters. I just had to change and learn the grammar. And Chinese grammar is very simple compared to Japanese or Korean or even English grammar. And so I started this is 1982. And then I studied here at graduate school at the University of Hawaii. And I went to Beijing in 1988, stayed at the Minzu Xuan and studied, in country, learned Beijing Hua, right?
Beijing Hua.
Okay. And then I went back to flying jets. So I didn't get to do much after that. But so I started in the 80s, and I've always been interested, but I haven't been able to focus on the language as much over time. But I will say the importance of studying language, and for the folks who speak both Chinese and English, you understand this, is that when you understand the language, you understand a lot about the culture. And the example I always use is this one. The word for population in the United States talks about, we count noses, right? We count heads. But in Chinese, there it is.
They count the legs.
We count mouths.
Oh, the mouth, okay.
Right? And I think that's important because the history of China is a history of, in many cases, famine and failed crops and things like that, and starvation. Because think about it, in the United States and China are almost the exact same size, but the Chinese territory only has about a half of the land that's farmable. You can only farm half the land, mostly because the West is all high Tibet Plateau. And China has always had 4 times the population as what we've had in the United States. 350 million today in the US, 1.4 billion in China. That's almost exactly 4 times. That means every acre of land in China has to produce 8 times the food. And, with Huanghe, with China's sorrow and all these other things, it's always been hard to feed a Chinese co. So these sorts of understandings, you take the history and then the language aspects, and it does help, people like me have a better idea of, Chinese history and culture.
From my knowledge, I can show you another point of view, another angle to observe this situation. It's why they call the population as a 人口, to judge from the mouth, because people need foods. The long history of Chinese developing, the long developing history, foods is almost always the first concern in people and the leadership.
If I make one more point on that, when Americans go to Beijing for a high-level meeting with Secretary Pompeo and Yang Jiechi,
yes,
the Chinese hosts spend a lot of time on the banquet, right? And it's the table settings are pretty, the food is extravagant, the entertainment is magnificent. Americans have no idea what that means. Americans don't understand any of that. They think it's just all window dressing. Americans, we think the highest honor is to give you one-on-one time between senior Chinese leader, senior American leader, alone in a small office and have a honest, candid conversation. We think that's the most important part of a meeting. And we end up talking past each other all the time. We don't get it. So both sides don't understand. We have to keep working on understanding.
Perhaps, Mr. Stilwell, you also noticed one of the words from their Communist Party's propaganda is we, CCP, offers the like how many 1.4 billion people the foods. So they think it's the most contribution to the humankind. Any government can solve the problem of this 1.4 billion people to eat. They have the they have the rights to continue their power. Yeah, that's one of their propaganda. That's why 人口 exists. right? But in another point, I think we also can think about this from this angle that 人口 the mouth express the idea. It's people can eat, people also need to talk, also express their idea. That's very important. So Communist Party, they just think that people, they can eat, so they don't have to speak out. If you want to speak out anything against my idea, against my will, then you are not able to eat. So, we talk about the treaty. In 1950s, there was a treaty between U.S. and Taiwan. We call it the Mutual Defense Treaty, right?
Yep.
At that time. Yeah. So it's a similar like U.S.-Japan security treaty, that there was a kind of a responsibility for both sides of the treaty. That one was attacked, and the other one we're getting the action of a military. So after U.S. established its formal relationship with the PRC, that treaty was abolished. Now CCP is much stronger than that time, and there is no treaty to provide the protection to Taiwan right now. Would the words of a White House be enough to deter CCP's invasion, and to say how to motivate Taiwan's determination of a self-defense? I think that's one of the strategy the CCP to hold, that after their invasion, like 72 hours or a few days later, the government in Taiwan will surrender. At that time, they will occupy this island legally. That's their words. 台湾现在是全球最大的地缘政治冲突热点之一了，因为它不可避免的跟南海自由航行问题牵扯在一起，是吧？美国在台湾的安全与战略跟50年代相比有了怎样的变化？这是我想给史迪威将军呢，您今天提的一个问题。原先呢，咱们知道是美国的任务就是防止共产主义扩张嘛，是一种意识形态的一种冲突，意识形态为主的冲突吧。那是不是因为现在的全球化经济，美国与中国与台湾利益已经相互交集了，就等于你中有我，我中有你，这是不是让这种情形变得更加复杂？美国政府会不会因为利益的牵挂，对台湾的支持变得力不从心啊？或者用咱们中国话说呢，会不会是雷声大雨点小？
A couple of things on that. One, in 1979, when we did change our recognition from Taipei
President
to
Nixon.
Beijing, we also at the same time passed the Taiwan Relations Act, which is congressional language that says we still have a relationship with Taiwan, right? The question of Taiwan is not settled. China, the one China principle, what Beijing calls its one China principle, says there's only one China and Taiwan's part of it. That's not our policy. Our policy is the question of Taiwan is unresolved. And our policy is that we insist that that question be resolved through dialogue, not through coercion or use of force. And so what Beijing is doing today by flying military aircraft like those, threateningly into Taiwan's airspace, using economic pressure, coercion, is in violation of the agreement in 1979 and 1982, the three communiques. And so, yes, the U.S., although we no longer have an explicit security treaty like we have with Japan, we still, in the Taiwan Relations Act, have language that says we will continue to provide military hardware, military equipment, so Taiwan can defend itself. And the third communique said, as long as China reduces its threatening equipment and presence opposite the Taiwan Straits, that we would reduce arms sales to Taiwan in order to reduce the risk of war on both sides of Taiwan Strait. Well, the corollary is also true. If the PRC continues to raise its threatening position on the other side, we feel no problem in raising our support to Taiwan. The point of this is to prevent China from feeling like it can just use force to dictate the outcome of the question of Taiwan. It's a very simple formula. Beijing understands this, but they have to use this other language. It says, you promised you would draw down our forces. We promised we would draw down if you draw down first, China.
现在最热的就是这个北京冬奥会了，中美之间大国角力似乎在所有的领域进行，现在已经发生在了似乎是原来并不太激烈的体育领域啊，不是说像原来一样，大家两个国家在一起比，你跑得快是我跑得快是吧？你有刘易斯，我有刘翔。那现在是关于中国奥运选手的国籍发生了争吵。我的印象当中，美国媒体从来不会关心自己的队员要不要回到祖国去比赛，不会那么小气的，因为所有的美国人都是移民和移民的后代构成的嘛。美国对于不同的文化和族群的宽厚，构成了美国多样性文化和生命力。但是这一次为什么变得小气了呢？就是您觉得这是不是美国在过去数十年的中共不断的盗取科技、盗取财富，如今的美国人开始觉醒，开始厌恶这种偷盗行为了呢？就算是在体育方面吧，看起来是个人的才华和能力的展现，但是比如说这个艾琳顾是吧？顾爱玲，她要是没有加利福尼亚常年的高级而且并不昂贵的体育设施的培养，她根本没有可能取得今天的技能，是吧？去塔后滑雪，一年四季都可以去住店呢，住的也不贵100多美元就一个晚上。这一点恐怕与中国的知识分子到美国来，在最宽容的研究气氛，在最先进的设备实验室获得成果，然后跑回中共去卖大钱千人计划大的报酬买走，有相同之处嘛，是吧？那我的意思是说呢，就是人才之争是表面的民族竞争，而中共的偷盗用对个人的腐蚀来弥补自己制度上缺乏竞争性的不足，是不是这次我们在冬奥会上，这个美国方面对于这种国际之争表现出的比原来更大的一种热度所反映出来的现象呢
？This is an 18-year-old or 22-year-old. Whenever she made that decision, she was still, young and impressionable. I mentioned Edgar Snow in my early days. I believed all that stuff when I was a kid, and I believed that stuff until I was 40 years old. Because I hadn't experienced it firsthand. My suspicion is when she comes back. Remember, she said that, well, don't worry about the great cyber firewall because they can always use a VPN, right, to jump over it. She forgot about the social credit system that says if you use a VPN, you're going to lose your good job. You're not going to go to college and all that. That's not her problem. She shouldn't have to think about those things. Let's not treat her badly because, like a lot of us, she is trying to assume the best about this system.
Right.
It's not their problem. But Wall Street's a different answer. The people on Wall Street know this is not going to work out. There is no ability to audit what they're investing in the PRC. There are these VIEs. Are you familiar with it? I can't remember what it stands for, but basically they're shell companies in the Cayman Islands. People who think they're investing in Alibaba or Tencent or Baidu, look it up. But AC, what it says is that as a foreigner, you cannot invest in China. You cannot actually buy Chinese stock. You can't own it. So what you buy is these fake, monetary things called VIEs, and they're worthless. They mean nothing, and so you will quickly lose. People think they're operating by the same standards they're operating in New York City and Wall Street, and they're not. It's totally different. I'm almost there. China investing. And so they think what they're getting is variable interest entities, is what it's called.
Okay.
So if you think you bought 10 shares of Alibaba or Neo or Evergrande, unfortunately, if you're dumb enough to do that, you didn't buy Evergrande stock. You bought this variable interest entity in the Cayman Islands. It's a shell game. And it's not, there's no real value there. And so people have to be very careful. When they invest in China, they have to do audits and they have to demand transparency. And you will never get either of those things. Why does not Wall Street acknowledge that? Why don't those people who claim to have fiduciary responsibility, meaning if you lose money, they go to prison, and yet they're never held to account for all these bad investments? And this is why we're going to kick 230 Chinese companies off of the New York Stock Exchange, because you cannot audit them. Their books, their transaction records are all considered state secrets. And for years, we allowed that to happen, and we're not allowing that anymore. Security Exchange Commission is actively kicking them out. And they can list on the Hong Kong or Shanghai Exchange, but they won't be listing on American